I never thought there would come a day when I would cut my parents out of my life completely. No matter how strained our relationship had been over the years, no matter how many times they made it clear that I was not their priority, I always believed that deep down, family was family. But that night, as I stood in their lavishly decorated mansion, watching my 8-year-old daughter clutch a handmade Christmas card with trembling fingers, her big brown eyes shimmering with unshed tears, something inside me broke. "Grandma," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the crackling fireplace and the sounds of my nephew unwrapping another expensive present. "Do you hate me?" The room fell silent. I turned to my mother, hoping, praying, for even a flicker of guilt, but instead, she smirked. "Gifts," she said smoothly, sipping her tea, "are for children who deserve them." Then, as if that cruelty wasn't enough, she turned her gaze toward my sister's son, Jacob, who was too busy admiring his brand-new gaming console to care about anything else. "Your aunt's child is real family," my mother added with a smile, my husband's hand clenched into a fist beside me. I felt my breath hitch, the room spinning for a moment. I had always known that my parents favored my sister Caitlin. She was their golden child, the one who had chosen to stay and take over the family business, while I, the disappointment, had dared to carve out my own path. I had accepted their bias, tolerated their coldness toward me, but this was different. This was my daughter. I glanced down at Lily. She was trying so hard to be strong, to hold back the tears brimming in her eyes, but she was just a child who had spent every single day of the past year visiting her grandparents, watering their garden, baking cookies, making them cards, and loving them with all her heart. And they had discarded her like she was nothing. I took a deep breath, forcing my voice to remain calm. "I understand," I said softly. "We'll never speak again." Then I turned, took Lily's hand in mine, and walked out the door without looking back. That should have been the end of it. But just a few days later, my parents were at my doorstep, crying. The drive home was silent. Lily sat in the back seat, her tiny hands clutching the Christmas card she had made for my mother, the one that had never been opened. I watched her through the rearview mirror, my heart shattering as she wiped her tears away with the sleeve of her dress. My husband, Michael, tightened his grip on the steering wheel. He had always been patient, always calm, but I could feel the fury radiating off him. "They didn't just reject her," he finally said, voice low and controlled. "They humiliated her." I swallowed hard, staring out the window as the lights of Greenwich passed by in a blur. "They made their choice," I whispered. "Now I've made mine." Michael nodded, as if sealing the decision between us. That night, as we tucked Lily into bed, she finally spoke. "Mommy." Her voice was so soft I almost didn't hear it. I brushed a stray curl from her forehead. "Yes, sweetheart?" Her lower lip trembled. Did I do something wrong? It took everything in me not to break down. "No, baby," I whispered, kissing her forehead. "You did nothing wrong. Grandma and Grandpa just don't know how to love the way they should." She nodded slowly, but I could tell she didn't understand. How could she? She was just a child, and children don't know how to rationalize cruelty. That night, I sat awake long after Michael had fallen asleep. I kept replaying the moment over and over again in my head, the smirk on my mother's face, the way my father had sat there and said nothing, the way Caitlin had watched the whole thing with that satisfied little smile. They had made my daughter feel like she was nothing. I wouldn't let them do it again. The next morning, I made a decision. I stopped all financial support to my parents. Most people didn't know this, but for years, I had been the one keeping my parents afloat. Even though I had walked away from the family business, I had still sent them money. $3,000 a month for their mortgage, thousands more for their medical expenses. I had done it out of obligation, out of guilt, out of some twisted hope that maybe, just maybe one day, they would finally see my worth. But that hope died the moment my mother looked my daughter in the eye and told her she didn't deserve a gift. By noon, I was sitting across from my accountant, Tom, making it official. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, eyebrows raised. "Your parents rely on this money to maintain their home." I met his gaze without hesitation. "They'll figure it out." He nodded, adjusted his glasses, and got to work. By the end of the day, my parents' accounts were cut off. No more mortgage payments, no more medical insurance, no more lifeline. I expected them to call immediately. They didn't. 2 days passed, then 3. And then, on the 4th day, I opened my front door to find my parents standing there. And they were crying. I stood in the doorway, arms crossed, staring at the 2 people who had spent my entire life making me feel like I wasn't enough. "Please, Amy," my father said, his voice hoarse, "just hear us out." For a moment, I considered slamming the door in their faces, but then I saw my mother's eyes, red-rimmed, swollen, desperate. It was the first time in my entire life that I had seen her look anything less than composed, so I stepped aside. They walked into the living room, but they didn't sit. Instead, my father ran a shaking hand through his graying hair, avoiding my gaze. "We're in trouble," he finally admitted. I waited. "The business, it's collapsing." His voice cracked. "Caitlin, she..." He exhaled sharply, like he couldn't even bring himself to say the words. "She stole from us." I blinked. "What?" My mother spoke up then, her voice thick with emotion. "Millions, Amy. She's been funneling money out of the company for years. The IRS is involved. There's an investigation. We could lose everything." I stared at them in disbelief. "And what exactly do you expect me to do about that?" My mother flinched. My father looked at me like he wanted to say something but couldn't, and that's when I realized the truth. They hadn't come here because they were sorry. They hadn't come here because they regretted what they had done to Lily. They had come here because they needed something from me. Money. Help. A way out. I let out a sharp, humorless laugh, shaking my head. Unbelievable. "Amy, please," my father begged. "We were wrong about everything. About you, about Lily. We need you." I stared at him, at the man who had sat silently while my mother told my daughter she wasn't family. And suddenly, it all became so clear. "I needed you once too," I said quietly, "and you weren't there." My mother let out a choked sob. We didn't know. Yes, you did." I met her gaze without flinching. "You just didn't care." Silence filled the room. Then, finally, I exhaled. "You should go." They hesitated for a moment, but when they realized I wasn't going to change my mind, they turned and walked to the door. But just before they stepped outside, my father paused. "Lily," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "Tell her. I'm sorry." And then they were gone. I stood there for a long time, staring at the closed door, my heart pounding in my chest. A part of me wanted to believe him, but I had spent my whole life waiting for my parents to love me the way I had always loved them. I wasn't going to let my daughter make the same mistake. I turned off the porch light, locked the door, and walked back inside. This time, I wasn't looking back. The next few weeks were quiet. For the first time in years, I wasn't sending a single cent to my parents. I had expected some dramatic fallout, angry calls, guilt-tripping messages, maybe even a desperate attempt to manipulate me into giving in. But instead, silence. At first, I thought maybe they were too ashamed to reach out. But then, late one evening, Michael walked into the living room holding his phone, his expression unreadable. "You're going to want to see this," he said, handing it to me. It was an article. IRS opens. Investigation into Bradley real estate for alleged tax fraud. My stomach dropped. I skimmed through the details, my hands tightening around the phone. The company, my parents' entire legacy, was under federal investigation. There were whispers of embezzlement, fraudulent transactions, and misallocated funds. And at the center of it all, Caitlin. Michael sat beside me, watching my face carefully. "It's bad, Amy. They're saying she might have stolen over $5 million from the company." $5 million. I sucked in a breath, my mind racing. My sister had always been reckless, but this wasn't just irresponsibility. This was a crime. "Do you think Mom and Dad knew?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Michael hesitated before answering. "I don't know, but if they didn't, they're finding out now." I didn't sleep that night. I kept thinking about all the times Caitlin had flaunted her wealth, her designer handbags, her expensive vacations, the way she always seemed to have more than she should. I had assumed my parents were funding her lifestyle the same way they had always prioritized her over me. I had never imagined she was stealing from them. The next morning, my phone rang. I didn't even need to check the caller ID. "Amy," my mother's voice cracked through the line. "Please, we need to talk." I closed my eyes, inhaling deeply. "Is it true?" A long pause. Then finally, she whispered, "Yes." She didn't even try to defend Caitlin. That was how I knew it was serious. "We have nothing," she admitted. "The business is collapsing. The house is at risk. The debts." Her voice broke. "The IRS. They've frozen our accounts. We can't even access our own money." I should have felt vindicated. I should have felt triumphant, knowing that they were finally facing the consequences of their choices. But all I felt was exhaustion. "Why are you calling me, Mom?" I asked, rubbing my temples. "Because you're all we have left." The words were like a slap to the face. I let out a bitter laugh. "That's funny. A few weeks ago, I wasn't even family." "Amy, please," she begged. "I know we were wrong. I know we hurt you. But please, we're going to lose everything." Everything. The mansion, the cars, the business. The life they had built on the belief that blood was more important than love. And now, after years of making me feel like I was second best, they wanted me to save them. I didn't answer. Not because I didn't know what to say, because for the first time in my life, I knew exactly what to say. But I wanted them to sit in their silence, to feel the weight of what they had done. And so I hung up. Caitlin ran. I should have expected it. The moment the investigation became public, she drained whatever accounts she had left and booked a one-way ticket out of the country. But she wasn't smart enough to cover her tracks. 2 weeks later, she was arrested at JFK International Airport, trying to board a flight to Switzerland. I got the news from Michael, who had seen it on the morning headlines. "She's going to prison," he said, setting his coffee down. "They're saying it could be up to 7 years. I didn't respond. I just stared at my cup of tea, watching the steam curl into the air. Michael reached for my hand. "Are you okay?" I nodded, but the truth was, I didn't know how to feel. Caitlin had always been my parents' favorite, their golden child, the one who could do no wrong. And yet, in the end, she was the one who had ruined them. The irony was almost poetic. A month later, my parents showed up at my door again. This time, they looked different. Their usual expensive clothes were gone. My mother wasn't wearing her designer jewelry. My father, who had always prided himself on appearances, looked smaller somehow. They had lost everything. And yet, for the first time in my life, I saw something in their eyes I had never seen before. Regret. Real, painful, bone-deep regret. "Amy," my father said, his voice unsteady. "We were wrong." My mother swallowed hard. "About everything." I didn't say anything. I just waited. "We let our obsession with bloodlines blind us," she continued, her voice thick with emotion. "We let Caitlin manipulate us. We hurt you. We hurt Lily." Her lips trembled. "And we don't deserve your forgiveness." She was right. They didn't. But then, from behind me, a small voice spoke. "Grandpa? Grandma?" Lily. She stood at the top of the stairs, gripping the railing with her tiny hands. For a moment, the entire room went still. Then, before I could stop her, she ran down the steps and threw her arms around them. "Don't cry," she whispered. "I forgive you." And just like that, years of resentment, anger, and bitterness unraveled in a single moment. I felt Michael's hand on my back, grounding me, and suddenly, I knew I wasn't doing this for my parents. I wasn't even doing it for myself. I was doing it for Lily, because she deserved a family that chose love over pride, even if I had to be the one to teach them how. A year later, everything was different. My parents had moved into a small apartment. Their lavish lifestyle was gone, replaced with something much quieter, much humbler, and surprisingly, they were better for it. My father had started volunteering at a local shelter. My mother had joined a church group, and slowly, painfully, they were learning how to be the kind of people they should have been all along. Lily visited them every Sunday, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. And for the first time in my life, I saw my parents treat her, Not as an obligation, not as an afterthought, but as their granddaughter, as family, real family. As for Caitlin, she was serving her sentence, and maybe one day, when she was ready, I would forgive her too. But not today. Today, I had my own family to focus on, Michael, Lily, and the life we had built together. A life that had nothing to do with blood and everything to do with love. And for the first time in a long, long time, I was happy.